First of all, thanks everyone for joining midsummer. I know there's a lot of things going on, and I'm going to try to kind of push us through some of the high-level stuff, but I did want to have some cadence on some, our overall view on where things sit these days. So the main topics today, we kind of did the halfway point last resilience call in June. By the way, we're recording it as well because a bunch of folks weren't able to join family vacations, etc. So but I want to make sure everyone's okay with the fact we're recording today. So we're really going to focus on a quick update on sort of the COVID outlook. I'm going to have Bob Pozen chat a little bit about this dichotomy between what's happening in the economy and the stock market, which I think is important, and we're all kind of puzzling our way through it. And then the bulk of the material here, we're really talking about if we are going into an extended COVID/recession as a more likely probability, and sadly it's gone up pretty dramatically on a percentage probability basis since we talked last. How do we go to market? And we're privileged to have Nick Petros from PinchForth, who was with us before, talking about on the D2C side, sort of best practices. We have Nick Harrison and Jason Vargas from RevShoppe talking about sales enablement and sort of their view on best practices and tricks of the trade going into a COVID go-to-market strategy in the fall on a more of B2B and SaaS, to be clear. And then Rob Elensky from Senso is going to talk a little bit about in an environment where you have complex B2B sales, in an environment you cannot see your customers, how do you manage through that? And so that's going to be the heart of the conversation. If we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll talk about managing inside the company. We've done that a little bit before, but given sort of the updated view on where COVID's going, some more conversations about how to make things like these conversations on Signal Wire work, really engage everybody, as well as managing expenses, etc. So that's the topic of the day. Thanks again for everyone joining. Any questions before we jump in? All right. If not, moving through these first couple of slides pretty quickly on COVID. Most of you guys know these numbers. Unfortunately, we're at 15 million global, 625 deaths. It looks like COVID's here and will be here to the fall of 2021. From a health point of view, Dr. Adrian Rawlinson sends his regrets, but I'm going to do his slides for him today. It's his wife's birthday, so a legitimate takeaway. For those that have not seen Dr. Bob Watcher's Ground Rounds, it's YouTube done on a weekly basis. The URL's here. If you're really trying to figure out what's actually going on from a medical point of view, strongly recommend that perspective. I'm going to go through the takeaways quickly. Most of you guys are aware, COVID's on the rise in the US. I think this is probably one of the more telling slides. This is the number of hospitalized patients per 100,000 people. You can see Texas, Florida, and Southern California really peaking. I think the scarier thing going into the fall is you're starting to see numbers increase in places like St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, and Chicago. So it is starting to come north. The states, obviously Georgia, Florida, and Texas are a bit of a mess. On Ground Rounds this morning, they had the head of the hospital systems in Houston, in Miami, in San Francisco, and as well as in Atlanta speaking. So I'm going to do a quick summary on the takeaways. The biggest takeaway from all these docs is this is a self-inflicted crisis that seems to be getting worse. The picture on the left is Southern California, Huntington Beach yesterday. The picture from Atlanta is the head of the Atlanta medical system talking about how the government manufactured numbers and presented them to the public to make them think they were safe when they were not. Houston is sort of the case rising there. One of the bigger, scarier comments they focused on and said, like, this is the number you should be thinking about is the positivity rate. So in Texas, positivity rate of people taking the COVID test is still around 25% of people getting the test are positive. I'm not going to go through all of these slides in the spirit of getting to stuff more interesting. Even in places like Northern California, where we think things are getting better, it's about 80% utilization of the ICU beds in a place where COVID's relatively low.
One of our VCs.
Hey, Sean. Sorry about it. I can hear you. So the fall, what can we be thinking about? So on the positive side, vaccine may be available earlier than we had thought and early in the year. Treatment is certainly getting better. Death rates are lower, but the big takeaway from this morning is the following. The sooner you move inside, the sooner you get hit, and that the lesson from the breakouts in the southern U.S., it has more to do with people being inside in air conditioning. So the fear is in the north and the northwest, as people go inside in central air from a heating point of view, we're going to have a bigger wave. The biggest thing that was consistent between all four docs was that their staff already are exhausted. So as we talked about PPE and other issues as being the big concerns, the number one concern all of these docs have going into the fall is we cannot create nurses and our staff are overwhelmed. Right now, ICU capacity in Florida is at 88% used, up 4x in 2 weeks. Houston at 85%. One of the things that I think we had sort of hope around was this idea of herd immunity. Unfortunately, the data there is not that great either. The only place in the United States that has close to the herd immunity number of 70% is San Quentin Prison, not too far from where I'm sitting right now. They're now at 60% infected in that prison population, and the virus isn't slowing. It continues to propagate. The consensus was the Midwest and the Northeast were likely to be the next big hotspots. And per the San Quentin data, because only 15 to 20% people have antibodies in New York, it's not likely, unfortunately, to be able to shield the region from a fall surge. And I guess the other big takeaway is because we won't have enough vaccinated and herd immunity people, we will not have herd immunity until the fall of 2021 earliest. So hate to be a downer on that. Welcome me to kind of listen to the docs directly in that video that I sent out. And Adrian says to all of you, he loves you. Sorry you could not be with us today. Wear your mask, stay six feet apart whenever possible, and do not gather in large gatherings, even though it's very tempting to want to do that. We are not out of the woods, is sort of the net there. Any questions on that material? Because I am definitely not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV. But did want to give you guys sort of the update from Adrian today before switching over to Bob.
Chris, I have the quickest of question. You
Sure.
would have shared it if you had the data, but that the San Quentin penitentiary, the 60% infection rate.
Yeah.
Do you have death rate numbers that come from that? I know that's probably not very representative of the population, but do you have death rate numbers from that facility?
Yeah, I think two. So there, and I'll send the slides out to everyone afterwards. There is, I think, they've had 15 people out of 2,000 die so far. The issue is that deaths really trail infection by about 21 days, and so most of these curves we're looking at are all less than 60 days old. So unfortunately, I don't think we sort of have enough data to kind of extrapolate, but definitely death rates are going down. That's the good news, and that's largely because the hospitals know what to do. The challenge, though, is if our second wave is 4x our first wave, which is what happened in 1918, the physical capacity of the people in the hospitals is going to be a limiting factor in terms of managing the death rate. And that was probably the scariest takeaway from the UCSF presentation this morning, which is the hospital capacities in terms of beds may be there, but the people to look after you, if you're there, may not be.
That's helpful. I mean, not good, but helpful. Thanks.
Yep. So the net takeaway is try to do what Canada does, take it seriously, and get the infection down as much as we can. So with all of that as backdrop, we've been saying pretty consistently since the fall of last year, keep 18 months of cash on hand. I can't stress that enough going into the fall. Just saying that again today. I think that's going to be a big factor. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk a little bit about this weird thing that we're seeing, where the stock market continues to go up, and yet the risks and the underlying economic data don't necessarily support it. So, Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. So let's just look at some numbers on the real economy first, and then look at the stock market. So the good news is we're a lot better shape now than we were in April, but the bad news is we're still not in very good shape. So in April, the unemployment rate was close to 15%. In June, it's a little over 11%. Most people are thinking by the end of the year it may get down to 9 or 10%, but that's still not very low. There are about 16 million people receiving unemployment benefits now, state unemployment benefits, and that's relative to a workforce of, say, 150, 155 million. So we have a very large number of people out of work, but in general, people are starting to get jobs, but at a much slower rate. Similarly, on GDP, it was down 5% in the first quarter. We don't have the second quarter numbers definitively yet, but the Atlanta Fed is predicting over 30% down. Most people expected a strong rebound in the third and fourth quarter, which would lead to modest numbers for the year, but that all depends on the virus. As Chris just outlined, there's been a resurgence in a lot of southern states, also in California. One thing, Chris, you didn't mention, which I think is really important, is there was a survey in the last week or so about how many people would take a vaccine if it was offered. And the number of people who would not take it was about 45%. And that's a very high number. Of course, there are some people there who are the very hardcore anti-vaccine people, but that's only a small percentage. I think if we talk to people, some people are saying, well, they don't want to be guinea pigs. They don't want to be the first people to take these vaccines. Maybe they'll work, maybe they won't. We don't know a lot about them. Another thing is all the experiments, all the trials on vaccines. There are no people age 60 or over who are in any of these trials. So we don't really know what the right dosage is, and obviously those people are very vulnerable. Also, I was talking to an African-American business guy the other day, and he said there are a lot of African-Americans who remember Tuskegee and feel they don't trust the government, and they don't want to be first in line here. If we look at the real economy, the other thing that I think is really important is to look at different segments. Obviously, we hear a lot about hotels, restaurants, theaters, and those are in deep trouble. But on online services, Amazon, Netflix, Spotify, games, they're all doing very well. Retailers, if you're on the ground, you're in trouble. But we see Amazon is strong, and Target and other retailers that have shifted a lot to online are doing pretty well. In real estate, the office market is cratering, but the residential housing market is actually quite strong, especially in the suburbs. And so we have a very mixed thing. And when you say how the economy is doing, we know the general trends, but it's important to look at the particular industries that you're concerned with. By contrast, the stock market has recovered most of what it lost this year. The NASDAQ is positive for the year, as this chart shows. The Dow is slightly negative. The S&P is close to zero. So that's a big disconnect. And the question is why? So here's what I think. The first thing you got to look at is what the government is doing. So the Fed has brought interest rates down to zero. When the risk-free rate is zero, people are inclined to invest in stocks. If you're getting close to nothing from cash or cash-like instruments, then people are much more inclined to take risk. We've seen already a big drop in rates for bonds, so the appreciation in bonds has already been achieved. If you're looking out a few years, it's hard to think if you buy bonds now that they're going to appreciate. If interest rates go up even modestly, bonds are going to take a hit. So in effect, stocks are the best deal, and U.S. stocks are relatively attractive. The government sent a lot of money to individuals, both the $1,200 grant and the unemployment supplements. Those are going to run out now, but they've helped the stock market. Companies got the payroll PPP program, the Main Street program, and then there were specific subsidies and grants for airlines and other particular industries. So that's one factor. The government has really shoveled a huge amount of money. The Fed's balance sheet is now in the $6 trillion range. They've been printing money. Fiscal subsidy was $3 trillion, and now Congress is discussing how much to put in the next round. In my view, it will be about $1 trillion, maybe a little more, but there clearly will be a big second wave. Nobody cares about the deficit anymore. People are saying interest rates are low, so you can handle it. Okay. So the second factor is that you have a very small group of stocks that are driving all these indexes.
Hey, Bob.
Yep.
Just a quick question before you go on. Can you calibrate what you think the federal government is as a percentage of the U.S. economy? Right now, I've heard numbers somewhere between 30 and 40% of the U.S. economy is now the federal government. Just how do you calibrate on that and the sustainability, I guess, of it going into the fall?
Well, you're talking about in terms of federal jobs relative to the rest of the government. It's much lower, but you're talking about the amount of money that the federal government is pouring into the economy at this time.
Yeah, both the fiscal and the monetary stimulus.
Well, it's equal. So GDP is about 21 trillion, and so we've probably put in about almost 40% of that this year in terms of both the Fed and fiscally. So I think that's where you get the 40%. That is that the federal money poured into the economy is roughly 40% of the GDP. So that's a good measure of how much this economy is being supported by that. This is clearly going to decrease going forward. People, I guess, in Congress were hopeful that things wouldn't be getting worse. But in the end, the government response is going to be determined by the healthcare, what's happening with the virus. So let me just finish up quickly and then we'll take questions. Number two is we have a small group of tech companies. We all know them: Amazon, Google, Netflix, Apple, Microsoft. Those are all driving these indexes. Tesla. So Tesla is going to come into the S&P 500, and so those account for a huge proportion. The S&P 500 is market weighted, and so when you have these big stocks that do well, it has a self-fulfilling prophecy. They keep going up. But this is the important point. The price-earnings ratio, if we look at the prices of stock relative to what their forward earnings are, it's now in the area of 23. And historically, the number has been about 17. So we're clearly way ahead of our skis in terms of whether stock prices reflect future earnings. And many of these earning streams, in my view, are quite soft because a lot of companies have withdrawn guidance. So we're really guesstimating a lot about future earnings. The other thing that we see is even small changes in the relative prospects of things have big effects on the economy. We saw that yesterday. Yesterday, the jobless claims reported at about 1.4 million. So that was ahead of the prior week, which at 1.3 million, and ahead of estimates. Those numbers have been going down, but this is for the first time jobless claims went up. So you can see how fragile the situation is when you're at these very high PE ratios. Then even small changes in the relative outlook can produce a significant drop in the market, which is what happened yesterday. So my own prediction is, and this goes along with what Chris was saying, is if the virus isn't, people are quite optimistic about treatments and vaccines, I think overly optimistic for some of the reasons I talked about. And as the reality of how slow this recovery is going to be becomes more evident, in my view, we're going to have another correction, not as bad as the first time, not a 30% drop, but we could easily have a 10 or 15% drop between now and the end of the year. Nobody knows, but it all, in the end, depends on what's happening with the virus. So I'm going to stop there and be glad to take questions.
Appreciate it, Bob. Any questions for Bob?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
So, at least where I live, which is suburban Connecticut, with things reopening, restaurants actually getting quite packed in some cases, what I'm hearing from vendors is that their biggest problem is that they are having trouble staffing people, like whether it's a barber shop or a restaurant or whatever, because of the unemployment benefits are so generous that people would rather just stay home and collect,
Well, Dan, you might know I published an article earlier this week pointing out how $600 supplemental benefits meant for most people unemployed, they were making more unemployed than they were working. And
Yeah.
I suggested that we bring it down as the unemployment rate down. We use $300 or $400 rather than $600. I was beaten up terribly in the comments, people saying, it's just people, they can't get work, they're looking for work, and there are no job openings. But in fact, there are millions of job openings that aren't being fulfilled. And so this is a very controversial subject. And I think the other thing is we had an employer tax credit in the CARES Act, which was totally lame. Nobody used it. The House has passed not just a continuation of the $600 for unemployment benefits, but it's passed a good employment tax credit, which would pay employers 80% of the labor cost of hiring or retaining workers. So that's a really good thing, and that's one of the few bipartisan things in the package. So hopefully we'll get the employer tax credit, the new, more generous one, and we'll have some feathering down of the supplemental unemployment benefits. But I can tell you politically, it's not an easy result, because even suggesting, as I did, you go from $600 to $300 or $400 supplemental. You look at what the overall unemployment rate is. Did not, lots and lots of people criticizing that article as saying you're hard-hearted. You don't realize There are all these people who are unemployed. They can't possibly get work. So
Yeah,
it's a tough
you have a
call
different question?
politically.
well, my question is that if we're at 11% unemployment in June, it seems like the prediction that that'll only improve to 9 to 10% at the end of the year. At least where I live seems, I would assume there would be an uptick in employment in August with these federal sort of subsidies disappearing. From the standpoint of people who actually are being offered their jobs back at their restaurant, like if you're bussing tables, I would stay home,
Yeah.
for the $600 a week, on top of unemployment, and that is definitely I'm hearing that from barbershops, from restaurants, etc. They can't hire. They're having trouble hiring people. They've got jobs that they want to fill, and people are just waiting until August, basically, to accept those offers back. And I would think that that would have some impact on the unemployment rate in favor of lowering the unemployment rate. But it sounds like that's not what the economists are sort of predicting.
No,
Well,
I think politically, what's going to happen is there'll be a continuation of supplemental unemployment benefits, but at a lower level. So if you think about somebody who's making, let's say, who's working 40 hours, making $15 an hour, they're making $600. They're going to get $300 roughly from standard unemployment insurance. So if you gave them $600, then they're making $900 a week rather than $600. You give them $300 a week, as I was suggesting, they're basically getting the same. So I don't think you're going to see those unemployment benefits, supplemental ones, go to zero. They're going to be here to be, I don't know, anywhere between at least 80% of what people would have made if they were working. So I don't think you're politically, it's not going to go to zero. The $600, if I had to guess, is going to go to $300 or $400.
Hey Dan, this next chart may help a little bit on some of the things that you're getting at. But if you take the bigger states, unfortunately, right now in the U.S., the bigger states from a U.S. economy point of view, Florida, Texas, California, all have high disease prevalence. And the health experts are basically saying when you have high disease prevalence and you have central air or central heat, the disease spreads much faster and you go back into indoor shutdown. So it's not that I don't think that the unemployment insurance number honestly is going to have the biggest impact on those job numbers in the fall, May and August. But whether or not, like California, basically shut down all indoor activities, in the last week. And you can imagine if you shut down all indoor activities through the Midwest and the Northeast in the fall, maybe September is okay, but as you go into October, it's getting harder and harder to be eating outside and kind of support a restaurant or a barbershop, in those conditions. So there's a lot of tricky factors here, but I think the big one, as I listen to the healthcare folks and the economists, is just think about the combination of high disease prevalence in large population states that have a big impact on the U.S. economy and the need to be indoors or not. And that's really going to be driving the employment or unemployment numbers more than anything else. Just a shout out to Mike Fordyce and the team at Ninth Decimal, since we're on the slide. So this is their economic mobility index. The last time I showed this to you, the end of June, EMI was around 91%. This is the first time we've seen the EMI start to dip down a little bit. And again, I think this really points to, these larger states, having, really high disease incidence. And that's really the challenge from a U.S. economy point of view. Any
I
other
agree with you.
questions?
I agree with you, Chris, that people's perception of whether it's physically risky to be back at work is going to be the key thing that drives it in the fall. And I think we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe you're right. Maybe going indoors will lead that. People thought that warmer weather would improve the situation a lot. It really hasn't. So I think we really don't know.
Yeah. And the interesting one is that sort of blip in sort of the Home Depots and Lowe's, which is the top line, those kind of home improvement type projects is, coming down precipitously. We are seeing, some raise in, mall activity and stuff like that. Mike Forte, feel free to jump in here, but, we're certainly not, back at a place where we're consistently seeing upward data. Unfortunately, we're actually seeing negative up data since we spoke last 30 days ago.
Correct. Yeah, it's a good overview, Chris. Thanks for the shout out.
Yeah. I love, for those that don't look at it, I look at the MI every week. It's a great indicator on sort of where things are going. You can do breakdowns by state as well. Dan, did that get you your question? I know hard to get answers to any questions these days.
No,
but,
that totally, yeah, that answered my question and makes sense.
Okay, so I guess.
But now I have another question.
Please. Yeah.
As an employer, and we got a small PPP loan, which we immediately spent on payroll. It was so small. Do we think there'd be more government subsidies that will benefit startups?
I think Congress is likely to give a substantial amount of, that's another point of agreement, substantial subsidies to small business. I think, as we all know, a lot of PPP loans went to people who aren't viewed as really needing them very big, and I think they'll focus a lot more on small business. So I think there'll be another dose. How big the dose will be, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think we'll know the answer probably within a week and a half. It looks like they're getting close to agreement on what the package looks like. So unfortunately, folks, I'd love to say a different point of view, but just sort of giving our best collective view, we're looking more like an L shape ahead of us, especially in the United States. And so with that in mind, we thought we'd talk about, okay, given that, how do you plan from a go-to-market point of view where you're not going to be able to be in front of your customers and operating normally? So we're going to talk a little bit about go-to-market ideas, best practices. Would love for everyone to kind of jump in on what you're doing, what you think. We're going to make this a little bit more free-for-all conversation. So we're going to start rather on the B2C side or all digital side with Petros, who joined us before, talking about sort of what they're seeing as best practices and things to be thinking about. We're going to move into more of a B2B SaaS and channels with both Nick Harrison, our associate here at BreakawayGrowth, who used to be at Yelp, and leveraging channels, Jason Vargas at RevShoppe in terms of their best practices in B2B in this environment. And lastly, Rob Elensky, who heads up revenue at Senso, is going to be talking about more complex B2B sales selling into financial institutions, where Senso is, how do you do that when you can't go see your customers? So that's the conversation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick to give us a quick overview on sort of his thoughts on what to do through the rest of the year.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So a quick background on us. We're PinchForth, do a lot of digital and product growth consulting and software, e-commerce, and professional services. So that's where this information is coming from. There are two key points here. One, clear real-time visibility into your performance metrics is more important now than ever before. Things are volatile, but they're also changing faster than they have before. So having like a direct pipeline and visibility into your performance metrics that's adopted across the organization is the fastest way to make improvements. because you eliminate the time it takes to get the team on the same page about what is or isn't working. So we started a company to help with that. It's called Dash. But this is kind of a quick background on us, and then we'll hop to the meaty stuff. So I think, Chris, you're going to share this after the meeting, right?
I am, yeah.
Awesome. So rather than walk through all these, I wanted to share one kind of significant thing that you guys could all use right away if you're doing anything direct to consumer. There's a higher level of online spend, particularly in e-commerce, than there has been in a couple of years. What that means is the bigger platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Google are pretty saturated. But they've been building systems for the last several years that outline on their end your entire conversion funnel. So from when a customer first discovers your product to when you bring them back for the second visit, all the way down to when they're actually deciding to consume, is visualized and modeled on their end in greater detail than it is on yours. So what we've been doing that you can all kind of use immediately is cross-pollinate by channel. More specifically, what that means is if you're driving discovery traffic to folks who've never seen you before on Facebook, for example, make sure your second touch is not also on Facebook. Make that on Google or one of these platforms like Taboola or Pinterest. What that does is break the algorithm inside of the advertising engines, which can cut your return on ad spend down by, or jack it up by 4 or 5x. So on Facebook, we had one advertiser that was seeing like a 1.8 dollars returned on advertising spend. By cross-pollinating from Facebook to Google, we were able to get that up to 5 with the exact same advertising against the exact same audience. So again, the specific tactic is create audiences on Google that are specifically driven first touch from Facebook. Create audiences on Facebook that are specifically driven first touch from Google. And only run retargeting advertising on both platforms against those audiences. You can make a lot of headway when the big platforms don't really know what your conversion funnel looks like and can't triangulate your true cost per acquisition. So if that was too nerdy, I'm more than happy to explain it in a couple different ways. But
So to put a fine point on it, Google and Facebook are basically figuring out how much you're willing to pay.
Exactly.
And will push you to that absolute limit. And if you can mask that from them, you can maybe get acquisition costs down.
Yep, exactly.
Right?
Well said.
Yeah. That's one of the things I love about Nick is he's got all these inside baseball ways to kind of get around increasingly consolidated power in the digital space by the big platforms. Yeah. One of the things that I didn't know if you were down on sort of the main things you wanted to talk about, but you were talking about Amazon as being more cost effective than Facebook and Google prior. I was wondering if you were still seeing that or if there are other thoughts.
Yeah, so we're seeing Amazon advertising is super effective, but I think it's kind of the same command and control strategy because they prioritize products that are fulfilled within Amazon and even more so products that are under Amazon brands. So we generally recommend that our partners avoid getting married to Amazon. If anything, use it to sell what we'd call a growth product. So a relatively low ticket item that can generate some revenue, but don't expect to make margin on that. Rather, use it as a way to introduce a customer to your brand. So when you hit them with a direct advertisement, you can make some margin on them later. We think we've been kind of noodling about this for a while, but we think there's going to be a boom in logistics and fulfillment centers over the next 18 months, largely because of COVID and everyone shopping online. So we're waiting for a company to emerge that can ship faster than Amazon to put a little more pressure on them because right now they really own it.
Just a question on that front. I don't know if anyone else is seeing it that's in physical goods distribution, but I'm hearing increasingly that concerns that in the second half and the fourth quarter in particular, that just as we were talking about the big constraint on the healthcare side is going to be people, that also people and logistics costs in particular could go up dramatically in the fourth quarter. and brands are trying to get ahead of that peak selling period in November, because there's just not enough distribution capacity, and shipping will increasingly be a big chunk of cost. I don't know if anyone else is thinking about that or have heard that, but I know not everyone's in the space of physical goods shipment, but that was something that was starting to become pretty clear as we enter August. So we're going to get surge pricing, I think, on logistics. If you're not thinking about that in your business in the fall, something to be thinking about. Nick, anything else before we kind of shift gears into the B2B space, or any other questions for Nick?
Nothing else for me, but happy to answer anything.
Cool. I know Dan Sherman wants to follow up with you, so I'll make that happen.
Sure.
So yeah, with that, I'm going to go over to Nick and Jason. You guys want to tag team this, or how do you want to do it?
Well, I want to make sure to give Jason as much time as possible. He's the real high value here, so I will just zip through a bit because when Chris and I were first talking about this topic, and the question was, what would you do if you were a founder sitting here today trying to figure out how to stand up a new go-to-market strategy for the second half of this year? In my mind, I immediately jumped to partnerships. And it's not just because that's where my background is from, but also because it's all about managing risk right now. When Dan asked his question earlier about workers choosing to go back to a restaurant for $600 versus staying home for $600, the answer is that the formula is a little more complicated than that. It's work minus the health risk versus government funding plus the value of that safety. And so similarly, how are you managing your investment risk trying to stand up a new sales strategy? What partnerships allows you to do is offload a lot of the costs of sales and lowers the number of new connections you need to make with customers when it's particularly difficult to make that happen remotely. So, just running through kind of low touch to high touch partnership models, the common element between all of these is that you're leveraging someone else's existing relationship to get you to a sale quicker and to leverage existing relationships. So on the affiliate marketing side, this is where it shares the most similarities with other digital marketing strategies, because you are filling the top of funnel. You're getting a lot closer to strategic marketing. And the ideal role of a partnerships hire in this field is to create a self-service, or at the very least low touch onboarding process to bring on these affiliate partners and help them start selling your product without you, the founder, having to do much of the training work. Channel sales is more of a direct relationship with similarly aligned companies. Here, you're really just trying to maximize your penetration into target markets that you've already defined and you already have a good playbook for. So this is where it's the most similar to direct sales, and you can actually have a lot of overlapping relationships between your direct sales hires and your partnerships people in this field. And then finally, and I know that Rob at the end will also be speaking to this a bit, is strategic partnerships. So this is where you're reaching out to a much larger entity and trying to create a bespoke arrangement that suits their needs in some usually strategic way, but gives you the advantage of scale. And this is the best way for you to really unlock a new category, unlock a new major account, is to start the work of investing in that relationship now and try to get a proof of concept done in a difficult time like this, that you can really scale up that business with them as things start to open up. But I do want to throw it to Jason because I know he's got a few great slides here.
You can just go to slide 25. Just skip the.
Yeah, and I'll send these slides out so you can follow up with Nick or Jason afterwards if you have interest. But a little slow loading, Jason, but it'll be up in a second.
So you guys, we work with a lot of companies ranging from like larger enterprise to smaller startups, and so and a lot of these organizations have different strategies, go-to-market strategies, whether they rely heavily on inbound, so they have a strong marketing engine, or if they don't and they're solely having to focus on outbound. Everything I'm showing here holds true for everyone. So just depending on your strategy, what we often find across young companies and old companies is that there are definitely missing links to actually have them have a very successful sales engagement strategy and go-to-market strategy. The biggest thing we see is that a lot of times their systems aren't really set up properly, right? So especially right now, you have to maximize everything you get from a lead standpoint, right? And a lot of companies are also reducing the size of their sales staff, and so in that case, when that happens, you have to make sure that all your processes are running as efficiently as possible. So one, you can maximize the efforts of your team. Two, you can maximize all the leads and technology that you have in place. So these are kind of the 4 things that we look at, and this you could kind of do a self-test for yourself, looking at your systems. We work with a lot of companies who leverage tools like Sales Off and Outreach. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those systems. Most B2B companies have one or one of these technology platforms. But what we do is we want to make sure that their systems are configured and they're integrated with Salesforce to make sure that you can accommodate whatever sales motion you have, whether it's an inbound or an outbound motion, right? Because if you have leads, if your inbound leads are come in that get clogged in Salesforce or don't make it to your Outreach or Sales Off instance, your reps aren't going to be able to really to leverage going after those leads, right? Which are very valuable at this moment in time. The governance portion, really, where we define all the permissions and make sure that they mirror one-to-one with Salesforce. So that way you can drive the desired rep behavior. If you guys have an SLA of like, hey, you got to get to these demo requests by 1 minute, does your systems allow the rep to actually do that, right? Once you have those defined, then we go into reporting, right? Looking at the metrics, looking at like, hey, you know, are you getting visibility and reports into what your teams are doing? Are you actually hitting those KPIs? If you're not, then you can start to coach and drive that behavior, or you can tweak your technology to make sure that
I get a lot of these calls, and I'm not gonna do anything until September on these races. I know very little about.
There we go. Cool. So the last piece is the adoption, right? We always want to hold reps accountable to the behaviors that we desire, right? If you have reps doing their own thing and you can't, you know, then it's hard to drive that repeatability and that predictability across your sales organization. And this one's a key one, right? We want to make sure that we can drive those desired behaviors. However, if your systems are integrated properly, if you're not matching the one-to-one with a CRM to drive those desired behaviors, it's gonna be really hard for your reps to adopt systems that you're paying money for, right? So these are kind of the 4 missing links that we often find across any organization. I don't care if they're enterprise or small startup, that's generally the case. So we can move on to the next slide. Here's what it kind of looks like and what we look for, right? And this is what you can look for as well. Whether you're using Gmail or Outlook, is that connected properly? Your automation rules, right? So we go on and, you know, you want to make sure that you set up the automation rules to fire off from from Salesforce to make sure that, hey, if this is a demo request, you have an SLA of 10 minutes. Do you have your system set up so that this can actually flow into any kind of cadence that you have set up for your team? Demo request fires off from Salesforce into your Outreach or Sales Off instance and automatically sends them an email or sets up a task for your rep to jump on that lead. Like those are the things that you want to have firing off. Speed to lead, like very important. And then making sure all your Salesforce fields are mapped properly from Salesforce into Outreach or Sales Loft. The reason you want to do this, right, is you want to create visibility in Sales Off or Outreach, so that way your reps know, hey, this is our tier 1 account, or hey, this person downloaded a webinar or white paper. That's good information to have, so that your team can then customize their messaging based on data that they're getting from Salesforce, right? So you have the alignment piece. So these are just kind of all the things that we want to make sure that any organization has set up to make sure that their systems are flowing properly so that the reps can do their job properly and maximize their efforts. Lastly, the ultimate sales stack. If we were going to start off from day one, this is what we would do. Make sure you have a data provider, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, or ZoomInfo, or both. I recommend both. Others choosing one of the sales engagement platforms that reach your SalesLoft, Chatbot, Drift, and then your CRM, we recommend Salesforce. If you're a B2C company, Drift is incredible chatbot. If you guys aren't familiar with it, that can really drive a lot of sales for you from any customers coming to your website. So I know it was very quick. If you guys have any questions, let me know.
Jason, I appreciate going fast, and here's the main thing that we're thinking about. One of the reasons why we asked Jason to come on, which is if we are going into a L-shaped trajectory, and on top of that, you're spending probably the most precious resources you've got. 20% of your expenses are going to be focused on sales and marketing. How do you make sure that those dollars, you're getting the biggest bang from them, especially given it's mostly going to be digital and not face-to-face? And so ask Jason to go really quickly through this, but he's certainly available to kind of chat with you. I know he's already engaged with the team over at Ninth Decimal and having a nice impact there. Any questions for Jason? I know Sean or Renee and Julie, are you guys using a similar stack, different stack? Any feedback you guys have before we wrap up, or other ideas as we go into the fall?
We use Drift in Active Campaign. Happy to if anybody has questions on how we do that, happy to help.
We're in a similar stack, although Drift didn't work out for us, so we're going to be using HubSpot's chatbot right now. It's not the best.
Yeah, Drift hasn't been the best for us, but it's very cost effective. Yeah, more so than the HubSpot gives you great pricing up front as an entrepreneur or early stage company, but then gets you really hard later. And then we use Nick a lot.
So I know we're kind of rushing through this, and Rob, I appreciate you being ready too. I think one of your big takeaways, and this kind of amplifies what our Nick Harrison was saying, which was, and I know Gentrio and Signal Wire and most of our portfolio company are doing this, is channel. I do think everyone knows channel, everyone talks about channel, but I do think in an environment where you cannot meet new customers face-to-face, especially B2B, having a channel that's effective, that has existing relationships, is probably going to be one of the few ways you can get a complex product sold going into the fall. And so I just kind of, in terms of emphasis, leaning in on getting channels effective going into the fall, as you think about what you're doing in August, I think it's just a good takeaway for all of us. Rob, anything to add to that before we wrap up?
No, I was going to show my screen, actually. Can I show my screen?
Probably not in the last minute, sadly.
Ah, okay.
I'd have to switch.
All right. Well, that's fine. I'll show the slides later then.
Send them to me and I'll integrate them.
Okay.
So look, we try to end these on time. The net, unfortunately, I have to say, is we were looking at a 30% probability of a second wave being worse than the first. It's probably up to 60% probability at this point. We did have baseball yesterday on the good news side, which is awesome. But we are looking at, just like we had in 1918, second wave is likely to be 4x worse than the first. So it's, you can see baseball in 1918. Here are our Oakland team, umpire, catcher, and batter all wearing masks. So wear your mask, guys. Couple last slides to wrap up. I can't emphasize this enough. I think it's more urgent than ever. Make sure you got 18 months of cash ahead of you. The pandemic and the economy, I think, unfortunately, are going to still be big challenges over the next 12 months. And please stay safe, calm, and awesome, as you guys all are. We're excited to be your partners. We're here to follow up and help out any way we can. and enjoy, hopefully, part of the summer. And don't forget these folks. They're probably more stressed and under more pressure than we've ever seen. So if there's ways to reach out and help out your local healthcare workers in helping them, please find ways to do that, because they're, we've got a tough road ahead of us. They've got a really tough road ahead of them. So love you guys. Be careful. Be safe. Enjoy the rest of your
Thanks,
summer.
everyone.